Hi everyone, hope you're doing well. This week we will be temporarily returning to Bloodborne to investigate an interesting question that I thought was worth mulling over. For those of you who follow me on Twitter, the Corvian video will be out a little later. If you don't follow me on Twitter, hit me up over there. I often have sneak peeks at future videos, as well as some run-of-the-mill shitposting. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. Several weeks ago, I started a thread on the Fextra Life Bloodborne Lore Forum, with the original post being this. Is there any way of justifying the behavior of the Healing Church? It's a topic I'm planning on making a video about. Thankfully, the folks that now occupy this forum are some of the greatest theorists of the Bloodborne lore community, putting a lot of effort and investigation into their thoughts before presenting them to others. I got a handful of replies, and I would like to go through them, as well as respond to them. I'm extremely thankful to those who answered my question, and I will give as much credit to them as I can as we continue. I will be reading their responses verbatim, so any grammatical errors are not my own, though I wouldn't worry too much about this, as the people who responded are very eloquent indeed. The first post is by a user by the name of Eldritch Imagination. Eldritch Imagination writes, well, the Healing Church is a group dedicated to studying the Great Ones, and to further human evolution into higher beings. Justification is subjective in this matter, depending on your outlook on human progress, and whether you think what they do to meet their goals is a just sacrifice for ascending humanity. The Healing Church is like the scientists in various stories who will do/sacrifice anything to complete their goal. To them, things such as morality or humane treatment is simply irrelevant. All that matters is the end result, regardless of the means. I think Eldritch Imagination really hits the nail on the head here, calibrates the conversation and setting it to a moral middle point, so to speak. I think it would be naive to simply believe that the Healing Church are just cartoonish villains who relish in the pain of their victims. That being said, humanizing the members of the Healing Church and looking at them as if they were legendary pioneers of their craft is just as simple and ultimately unsatisfying. They are complex people, and we'll understand this even better as we continue. As Eldritch Imagination puts it, justification is subjective. What one person may consider abhorrent, another may consider acceptable and necessary. Let's move on. The next post is by Surrogate of Cos. Surrogate of Cos writes, a justification of morality would be the prosperity, spirituality, and medical science brought to Yharnam through the old blood more than anything else, which makes Yharnam attract outside visitors, cures all diseases and ailments, other than ashen blood, and provides the key to evolution. The only thing that would be necessary is making sure people resist the temptation of, as Alfred says, letting the blood get to our head. So the prayer goes, seek the old blood, because it soothes our fears and satisfies our desires. The frailty of men is what makes people turn into beasts or go blood drunk, according to the church, who may or may not know better that they are the cause of all trouble happening. Vicar Amelia didn't seem to know better, or maybe she did, holding that pendant, or maybe she was just as confused as most of why people transform. But the Healing Church should have done enough testing to know the effects of their blood, but even as the beasts took over, each of the factions, Mensis, Choir, stayed or locked themselves in their bases and ended up dead or completely transformed in their experiments and struggles. The old Healing Church burned an old part of town down. So, again, there seems little morality in the actions of the Healing Church that cannot be seen as an outright lie by them, or just the opinion of a devout follower. Even the church doctors' make it seem very sinister and corrupt indeed, so I think it's very much like in Berserk in that way. But how ready was the church really? They seem to view the blood as a means metamorphosis, so maybe they're going to thank us when they're gods, or the rest of humanity is going to thank us when we are gods. Thank you for writing, Surrogate of Cos. Surrogate of Cos makes a good case here. The factor of the frailty of man is introduced, which I think is something definitely worth considering. Beasthood could be considered a sign that the body of a man is not sufficient to ascend to that of a great one. Surrogate also brings up the ends justify the means angle, which is a metaphor for all of Bloodborne, and especially the regret that often follows these sorts of affairs. Consider Maria's advice to you. A corpse should be left well enough alone. It's been theorized by Redgrave and others, presumably, that she may be referring to the corpse of Cos rather than her own. The slaughter of the fishing hamlet was justified, at least in the minds of the Church, as a necessary evil for the eventual benevolent advancement of mankind. Some of the largest technological leaps of our time have occurred during times of great strife or tragedy, after all. In World War II, for instance, it popularized and advanced the usage of nuclear power or force, depending on your perspective, as well as penicillin, computers, and so on. We don't often consider the origins of these things and why they were needed originally in the world of today, because a reasonable amount of time has passed. The same thing could be said for Yharnam in a way. If the Healing Church discovered a way to effectively and efficiently clean the old blood through blood saints or otherwise, so that it would not present any side effects, then 100 years down the road, the population of Yharnam may not consider those who have lost their lives in the pursuit of this conclusion. The next post comes from the user Rakuyo, who is quite active both on the Fextra Life forums, actually extremely active, as well as the Bloodborne subreddit. He writes, "Morality. That is something hard to come by in Bloodborne. What we can try and do is understand their motives. The Healing Church. The Healing Church is the original group dedicated to the Old Blood venture. It would later split into subgroups like the Choir, the School of Mensis, the Executioners, Vile Bloods, and what remains of the Healing Church. The original motive of Lawrence and the first vicars was likely to help people, offering them longer life and release from disease. Likely, what the Healing Church does is directed by great ones. Fear and the promise of heaven/hell is no doubt a strong motivator. There may actually be such things as heavens and hells. The hunter's nightmare is a hell for hunters. I theorize that Fishing Hamlet is a heaven for the misshapen Tlalocan. Important figures in the Healing Church are Formless Uden and Uden. There's also Cos, who I believe is depicted in various places as a clam, Cathedral Ward for instance. Then there's the Headless Woman found in the Grand Cathedral. The Headless Woman also appears in the Labyrinth. In Annalise's throne room, many statues of the Guinevere look-alike can be found beheaded. Rakuyo is a very talented lore hunter, and I suggest you go look at it as his work on Fextra Life when you have a chance. He brings some fantastic insight into the lore of Bloodborne, and I would say his most pertinent point here is the framing of several iterations of the Healing Church in the context of evolution. As Surrogate pointed out, Amelia's prayer helps us understand the Healing Church's viewpoint on humanity. Remain wary of the frailty of men. Their wills are weak, minds young. Were it not for fear, death would go unlamented. Seek the old blood. The Eldritch Truth and the work of the Choir makes it easy for vicars like Lawrence and Amelia to essentially put morality to one side. Viewing the Eldritch Truth allows the members of the Church to justify in their minds their work. Rakuyo's extrapolation on the Healing Church's beliefs in planes comparable to heaven and hell allow us an insight into the minds of those who would seek the old blood. Another time in which heaven and hell were taken very literally were the early Middle Ages, around 1000 AD to 1400 AD and even beyond. Tapestries still stand in Europe depicting people suffering in the flames of fire and brimstone, landscapes of hell that were seen as a very literal possibility to those capable of sin. To avoid ending up in a cycle of endless torment, the people who followed the Catholic Church during this time would seek absolution, often manifesting in repenting, participating in indulgence, a practice that sometimes required paying actual money to absolve sin, or killing in the name of God, like the Crusades. This fear that the Healing Church may have had hell or otherwise allows us to understand their motivations even deeper, in my opinion. Now we come to the response by Zephyrd7, and I really like this response, and I hope you really enjoy it as well. They write, "Its behavior when?" This is a really hard question to tackle because a lot of the good the Healing Church does is directly tied with the bad. It seems like an unadulterated good that it provides healing from injury and disease on a mass scale, but you have to grapple with how it can do that. It experiments on whole populations, like the entire city of Yharnam by the end, to derive blood that will evolve humans to a higher plane. The healing is a cover and a side effect of that. Its experiments lead to the scourge of beasts, and it lets people believe that the scourge is a communicable disease instead of a result of taking blood. Between the old hunter armbands and the beast's embrace rune, you can make that case. To further cover these experiments, it disguises removing potential threats to them under zealous hunts to combat the scourge, killing innocents to keep the secret. The Harrowed set and the Black Church set make the case for this. The Church is feared. It inspires a kind of xenophobia in Yarnamites, hinted at by Gilbert, but most explicit with a lonely old woman who says, "Yarnamite's blood is ruined, tainted by your ilk." The aforementioned law entries indicate that it deliberately cultivates this fear to keep people in line, keeping them from asking too many questions about their miraculous blood healing and the beasts that always seem to emerge. But even with all that, you could make a utilitarian case for the Church that it seeks what Willem and Lawrence sought, evolution for the greater good. The note in the Lecture Hall 2F that speaks of evolution without courage suggests they felt they had no other choice unless they wanted to risk extinction. This is why I ask, when? The change from fear the old blood to seek the old blood could just be another instance of the Church attempting to keep Yarnamites in line with doctrine, but the modern form is chanted by Vicar Amelia, the leader of the Church, right before she transforms into a cleric beast. As the Sword Hunter badge says, clerics transformed into the most hideous beasts. When you reach Upper Cathedral Ward, the orphanage is overrun with scourge beasts and brain suckers. The suckers are presumably possessed by phantasms, but the scourge beasts would likely be a result of abusing blood. This doesn't seem to be the case early in the Church's history. In the Hunter's Nightmare, the majority of beasts are not in an advanced form like the scourge beast, but are beast patients like those found in Old Yarnam. This all suggests to me that timing is very important. At the beginning, the Church knew the risks of what it engaged in. It failed, as the Beasts in Bruce Rune tells us, but it had an idea what it was doing. In the present day, the widespread catastrophe and spread of the scourge, with the leaders of the Church just as ravaged as the populace, says to me they've mostly forgotten the dream of evolution. Some of them remember it. Fosefska is perhaps the best example. I believe he's referring to the Yusefska imposter, possessing a cord of the eye and evolving people to kin, even after she escapes Upper Cathedral Ward, though one could question how altruistic her motives are. Yuri is at Bergenworth for seemingly no reason, maybe desperately looking for research or even Rom, but the choir, the most learned and highest-ranking clerics of the Church, as a group fell to the scourge. If you're asking if the modern Church can be justified, I would say no. The Church of the past, possibly, but my response doesn't even touch on what happened in the fishing hamlet. You could say the fishing hamlet was really Bergenworth, and may not be wrong, but one wonders why the Healing Church wants to keep the fishing hamlet so secret then. My own history of the Healing Church is somewhat kind to them, thinking that in the research hall they only experimented on a select number of people, perhaps patients who, with the primitive blood healing of the time, had diseases that couldn't be cured. Even after the disappearance of the old hunters, from the comments I got on my history at Reddit, the idea that the research hall itself disappeared like the lecture hall is controversial. The Church limited its experiments to Old Yarnam, and at that point probably still knew the risks of what they were doing. However, you have to stretch a felicific calculus really hard to justify using a whole population as a testing group for experiments. There is a real event we can compare this to, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, in which the US federal government claimed to be treating black men for syphilis, but instead let the disease progress to study its effects. The contrast isn't favourable for the old Healing Church, as one could argue easily, throwing in the white church garb's description that notes, they believe medicine is not a means of treatment, but a method for research. That the Church deliberately exposed people, and themselves, to the scourge to further their science. Then again, they and their heirs thought they were facing extinction. Dan Carlin makes his point in his podcast about evaluating leaders and policymakers in the Cold War that everything they did was against the backdrop of knowing that a war between rival powers could become a global holocaust. They did terrible things, proxy wars, arming and supporting dictators and repressive regimes the world over, probably most egregiously the bombing of Cambodia, but they felt justified because of the existential threat a direct war would entail. I imagine the clerics in the final days who remember this is all over evolution feel the same way. This is a brilliant summary by Zephod7 and is to be commended for this. Zephod really attempts to specify the point at which Bergenworth and the Healing Church did away with precaution and gained, as Willem puts it, courage. If extinction was a real, tangible threat in Yharnam like it had been in Loran previously, then ascending could, from a certain point of view, be seen as a veritable course of action. However, since we never really get a true sense of the stakes at hand and the danger presented to Yharnam, it is not possible to make an objectively correct conclusion on this question. I think it's very important, as Zephod does, to understand that the Healing Church were not always as villainous as they appear. Lawrence was a man of science, a scholar working for the betterment of mankind initially, but eventually lost his way, like so many other members of the Church. The road to hell is paved with good intentions indeed. Zephod also makes a good point about the connection between the White Church doctors and their patients, allowing diseases to fester rather than treating them. Along with the Tuskegee example, there were other earlier examples of doctors experimenting on the disenfranchised in the 1900s and onwards, particularly on lepers, the mentally ill, and prisoners of war. There are even examples late into the 1960s of the elderly being injected with cancerous cells to see how the body would react. Again, a fantastic understanding by Zephod7. Onward to Surrogate's response. Surrogate, of course, responds to Zephod, saying, "Brilliant, Zephod. It does seem like the Healing Church clerics are just as ravaged, but I think the top guns of Mensis and the choir still know what they are doing." Yuri plus Fosevska does point to the choir still remembering the dream from the time of Bergenworth of rediscovering true greatness, and decided to continue that which was left undone in the Hamlet, Research Hall, and Bergenworth, so that humanity could truly take on a form of greatness, even in physical, by overcoming physical limitations such as beasthood and lower faculties of the mind. They succeeded too, and became the celestial emissary, or one with it, while the remainders were left to the scourge, or to become the slaves of phantasms. Mikolash and the rest go through with the Mensis ritual to allow themselves to ascend away from the world, because, as the cage says, it allows one to see the profane world for what it is, and so leaving behind this limited world, the school of Mensis goes some planes higher. They succeeded too. They left the physical plane to ascend higher astrally, almost right next to the moon even, and call upon the Great Ones to free them from their shells and give them new cosmic forms. So rather than fail, they all seem to have succeeded. Except, did they really get what they wanted? Spiders and grey/blue aliens may not be their true idea of greatness after all. They left behind piles of dead Yharnamites and companions alike, but at least got into contact with their gods at the end. But do the gods love their creations? Also, Rikuyo, I love that Lalocan connection. Makes me think if the Hamlet was always an afterlife plane, or if it became so after the raid. Imagine the blasphemy of tomb prospecting a heavenly realm and leaving its version of Hippocrates cursed and defiled. This is a very good reply by Surrogate, especially to frame up a certain conclusion to the Healing Churches and also the School of Mensis' work. It is an important question to ask if Mikolash and the rest, was it worth it? Are the celestial emissaries the best that they could have hoped for? It could be argued that the celestial children, hybrid great ones born from the womb of a human woman, are the best example of success, but if ebrietas is the eventual result, then it does not seem like a satisfactory end to so much death and wish for a greater good. Again, it could be argued that the Orphan of Kos was similar, or closer to what they were attempting to achieve, a bipedal being, extremely strong and powerful, but one must wonder about the mind of such a being, and whether the sacrifice of a conscience of human frailty is worth it. The final response comes from a user by the name of DN1ND. They write, "Something of interest on the Church's morality was its stance on the old blood and blood ministration. All of the Church's decisions seemed boiled down to preserving and refining the old blood. Destruction of it was seen as heretical, as shown by the powder kegs, while competing bloodlines were seen as abhorrent, as shown by the vile blood's extermination. The whole purpose of this was refining, and preservation of blood was for communion, which spread and exacerbated the scourge, giving blood ministration spread it, while Mensis' ritual exacerbated it. As for the Church's morality, I view the entire organization as amoral, since they seemed indifferent towards the consequences of their actions, even going as far as guarding the wrongs of their founders." DN1 and D's response is the final comment from the thread, and while it retreads old ground, the concept of refining the blood is worth commenting on. When looking at the blood of Adeline, it helps us understand that while the Healing Church are guilty of committing awful evil acts, they also made many attempts to purify the old blood to make it function without any side effects. The description of the blood reads, Adeline was originally one of the blood saints who received treatment by the church to cultivate worthy blood. Adeline's was one of the few cases that turned out favorably. The blood saints, like firekeepers from Dark Souls, are vessels for a potentially malevolent force, old blood for Bloodborne, humanity for Dark Souls. The description goes on to say that there were only a few cases that were a success, and a limited number of blood saints were produced. Many of these saints presumably were sent into the Chalice dungeons, as I have stated in previous videos, proven by the description of the Mad Sages and the descriptions of the items they drop, but that is a topic for another day. I'd really like to thank the contributors to the Fextra Life thread. They have a truly excellent grasp of the lore, and every time I visit I'm reminded of this fact. Despite Bloodborne growing in age, it continues to attract people who love the story and the lore, myself included. I will link to the thread in the description if you would like to comment your own thoughts or read the responses for yourself. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time.